This is a compulsory security check. Open up now or face the consequences. The HOA security officer barked, his electric baton humming ominously in his thick hand. They pulled up to my lakefront cabin like they were hunting down a high-profile criminal over some alleged infraction they still hadn't bothered to explain. I refused. One of them charged at me, ready to cuff me on my own aging porch. What followed was the wildest, most unpredictable confrontation I've ever experienced. I moved it just slightly precisely where they didn't anticipate, and in less than 10 seconds, silence fell like a curtain. I stepped calmly back onto my deck, picked up my coffee mug, and took a slow, deliberate sip. As for them, they slithered off my property like the earth itself had delivered a brutal lesson. Drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from, because sometimes, all it takes is one well-placed move. I'm Dylan McKenzie, retired Navy man. These days, I lead a quiet life by Lake Clearwater with my golden retriever, Ranger. But today, I'm sharing the story of the day I went from peaceful fisherman to the HOA's worst nightmare and uncovered a conspiracy they'd kept buried for 15 years. Let me set the scene. At 52, I inherited this lakeside cabin from my uncle, Mason McKenzie. He was an old sea dog who built it himself in the 80s. It wasn't glamorous aged cedar siding faded by decades of storms, a porch that moaned underfoot, but it was sturdy, permitted, and mine. My days were simple, casting lines into the clear water, tinkering with junked cars in my makeshift garage, and sipping coffee alongside Ranger, a clever 7-year-old retriever with more sense than most people I've met. The place sat on a prime slice of shoreline, framed by tall pines and overlooking a federally protected wetland that had been untouched since the Carter era. That Saturday morning started like any other. I was brewing my usual Colombian dark roast on the old wood stove when I heard the deep growl of high-end engines echoing across the lake. I looked out the kitchen window and saw a fleet of luxury cars barreling down the dirt road like some kind of polished assault team. In front was a spotless white BMW X7A worth more than my annual pension, trailing a black Escalade and a gleaming silver Mercedes, showroom fresh. Out of the BMW stepped Karen Goldwater. Every move she made radiated practiced authority, the kind that bulldozes opposition without saying a word. She was 58, her hair bleached into an immovable helmet of control, and her blood-red nails looked like they could slice steel. She wore an elegant cream blazer that likely cost more than most people's rent and walked with the confidence of someone who'd never been denied anything in her life. Following her came her personal circus. First was Chuck the Bull Morrison, a towering, muscled, and about 250 pounds of barely restrained furry. His neck was thick enough to support a tree branch, and his tight black shirt clung to him like it was bracing for impact. His eyes were cold, detached, the look of someone who thrived on violence. Then came Marcus Steele, a lawyer who looked like he built people for breathing wrong. Expensive suit, smug glare, and a leather briefcase filled with paperwork and lawsuits. Last was Tanya Voss, a frosty secretary who appeared to have ice in her veins and a permanent scowl on her lips. Her hands clutched an iPad like it contained military launch codes, her fingers moving with courtroom precision. Karen strutted up my deck as if it were her own palace. "Mr. McKenzie," she snapped in a tone sharp enough to shear steel, "this property is in clear violation of Clearwater Lake Community Guidelines, Article 23 BA non-compliant structure aesthetics and poor maintenance standards." I stepped through my screen door, coffee still in hand, and met her gaze with the calm of a man who'd seen real storms and not the petty ones stirred up by bored suburban overlords. "Good morning, Mrs. Goldwater," I replied evenly. "That's quite the claim. I've got all my permits squared away, and no one's ever mentioned a problem until now." She waved toward my cabin like it was a biohazard. "Unauthorized modifications, non-regulation paint colors, an unleashed animal on your property. We've got board-mandated inspection orders." Her voice rose with each complaint, high enough to spook wildlife for miles. That's when I noticed something odd. None of them were looking at the cabin. Their eyes kept drifting to the shoreline, specifically the 2-hectare stretch of untouched land beside my lot, land labeled with a bright yellow sign, "Protected Ecological Zone A, Federal Development Prohibited." Karen wasn't documenting my so-called violations. She was snapping photos with her iPhone, photos of the view from my deck, sightlines, and angles across the lake and into the restricted land. Tanya marked each angle and frame on her tablet like she was drawing up battle plans. When I asked to see their inspection authorization, Tanya produced a document still warm from the printer, ink smudging at the edges. I raised an eyebrow. Fresh off the press. You print this in the car? Then I glanced at Marcus' business card and that's when my Navy instincts kicked in. He wasn't whole legal. He was counsel for something called Lakefront Developments LLC. And the address on his card? Same one as Karen's mailbox. Karen's face turned crimson, and she snapped her fingers at Chuck. The human wrecking ball stepped forward, each stomp shaking the deck boards. You gonna play nice? He rumbled, voice like gravel. Or do I drag you out of here the hard way? He reached for what looked like a makeshift electric baton, buzzing with a manufactured menace designed to scare folks who'd never seen a real fight. I met his stare, unflinching. I'd captained destroyers through typhoons, faced off against pirates in the South China Sea. I didn't blink. There was a tone in my voice, a calm one, sure, but with an edge sharp enough for anyone with a functioning brain to catch. It was a warning, whether Chuck realized it or not. I served 30 years in the U.S. Navy, I said evenly. Kid, I've seen every kind of escort you can dream up. You sure you want to test yours? Chuck's jaw tightened like he was chewing on gristle, and his fists, each the size of a cinder block, clenched at his sides. But just for a second, something flickered behind those dull eyes. A glimmer of hesitation, instinct, maybe, or experience whispering that this wasn't going to be the cakewalk he'd imagined. Behind him, Karen screeched from the safety of her entourage, completely oblivious to the tension building in front of her. Chuck, do your job. I just smiled, the same smile that once made rookie officers aboard my ship start sweating bullets. I'd tread carefully if I were you, I said, taking another slow sip of coffee. There are a few broken bar surprises in this yard. Chuck moved in like a predator stalking easy prey, the homemade electric baton crackling with theatrical menace in his grip. It sounded like something out of a discount action flick. He was sizing me up as just a lean, 52-year-old man in jeans and a flannel shirt. Probably figured I'd drop like a sack of flour, but what he didn't see was the steel behind my eyes, the calm, unshakable cold that comes from 3 decades at sea dodging missiles, surviving typhoons, and facing down real threats. He should have listened to that gut feeling. But men like Chuck, they usually learn the hard way. I stepped aside casually, brushing my hand against what looked like a simple wooden trim on the cabin wall. Chuck didn't even blink. He should have, because what I'd actually done was flip a switch, a part of a modified irrigation system I'd rigged years back after a particularly nasty run-in with raccoons. It had started life as a lawn sprinkler setup. I turned it into something more interesting. I triggered the system with the same fast reflexes that had once guided a warship through combat zones. In an instant, 12 high-pressure sprinkler heads burst up from hidden slots all around my property. A full-circle perimeter spraying with the precision of a well-executed ambush. Chuck was halfway through his charge when a jet of icy water slammed him square inches the face, knocking him off balance. The soaked ground beneath him turned to slick mud, and he went down hard. Even better, that DIY electric baton in his hand made contact with the spray and fizzled violently, sending a jolt through his massive frame. He hit the ground twitching and flailing like a gaffed fish on a dock. Marcus, the $3,000 suit legal shark, let out a noise that sounded like a yelping poodle as his overpriced loafers lost grip. One moment he was upright, the next he was face first in the muck, his designer suit turning into a mud-stained wreck. His fancy briefcase flew open, vomiting legal paperwork all over my lawn like confetti at the worst parade you've ever seen. Then Tanya let out a shrill gasp in my iPad. Just as her stiletto heels sank into the soft, waterlogged turf like anchors, her tablet slipped from her grip and landed with a satisfying crack, the screen webbing out like shattered glass. It was as useful now as a chocolate teapot. Me? I stood exactly where I planned, dry as a bone in the one spot I'd designed to stay clear of the blast zone. I took another sip of coffee, soaking in the chaos with quiet satisfaction. Like watching the final move of a checkmate unfold. Automatic sprinkler system, I offered, sounding almost apologetic. Should have noticed the warning sign. And that's when something clicked. While her wrecking crew floundered around like extras in a slapstick comedy, Karen hadn't moved. She was bone dry, standing in the one precise location beyond the reach of the water, which meant a broken bar she'd known. Che or Saminia had studied my property beforehand, mapped it out, calculated the safe zones. This wasn't a spontaneous inspection, it was a coordinated op, a planned strike. Karen's voice hit a pitch just shy of glass breaking. This is assault, premeditated assault. I'm suing you for everything you've got. I simply pointed to the small red sign by the door. Warning, automated irrigation system, stand clear when red light is flashing. Then I gestured to Ranger, who was sitting nearby with the patience of a monk and a small camera strapped to his harness. Everything's on tape, I said casually. High def, 4K, he wears it to record wildlife. Guess today, you folks made the highlight reel. Soaked, sputtering, and humiliated, the trio finally sloshed their way off my land like a defeated army retreating from a lost battle. As they went, Marcus dropped an envelope in his haste. I waited until they disappeared up the road, then picked it up. What I found inside turned my stomach cold. It was an email chain between Karen and the CEO of something called Lakefront Developments LLC. The subject, Phase 2, Clear Mackenzie Property for Marina Resort Foundation. It spelled everything out. Karen had muscled her way into the HOA presidency by blackmailing the former president, Ernest Caldwell, spreading false rumors of embezzlement until he stepped down. I stared at that email, letting it all sink in. The pieces were falling into place. Marina Resort, I muttered, eyes drifting out over the lake. A large sign made it abundantly clear. Public waterfront, a protected wetland area. Federal law strictly prohibited any development. This wasn't just about HOA rules or neighborhood aesthetics. This was about greed, a big money, and my humble cabin was smack in the middle of someone's multi-million-dollar land grab. That's when my phone rang. The voice on the other end was masked, digitally distorted, but the message came through loud and clear. Mr. Mackenzie, you don't know what you've stepped into. Karen Goldwater is far more dangerous than she seems. Watch your back. Then the line went dead. I stared at the envelope Marcus had dropped, suddenly aware that I was standing on the edge of something much deeper than petty neighbor politics. Word of the Great Water War at my cabin spread through Clearwater faster than gossip at a church bake sale. Rangers go pro footage, yes. My golden retriever wears one to monitor wildlife was posted in the Clearwater Residents United Facebook group. By the time the sun set, it had over 50,000 views. At first, folks dropped by out of curiosity, wanting to see where Chuck had been sprayed, or where Tanya's heels had sunk like anchors. But the visits quickly turned into something else. People weren't just coming to look, they started talking. What I heard in the hours that followed made something old and powerful rise in me, something I hadn't felt since my military days. The first was Bill Hicks, a 70-year-old retired math teacher and recent widower who'd been left to navigate the HOA jungle on his own. He sat heavily in a deck chair, hands trembling as he pulled out a folder of official papers. "Dylan," he said, voice low, "that woman fined me $500 because my newspaper hadn't been picked up by 6:15 a.m. I tried explaining arthritis slows me down in the morning, but she threatened to report me for property neglect, said I was tanking neighborhood property values." He'd paid the fine, out of fear, and I saw how the pressure had worn him down, turning a once proud teacher into a man walking on eggshells. Then came Rosa Martinez, a single mother in her mid-40s who worked double shifts at the county hospital. She looked beyond exhausted of fighting battles on too many fronts. My daughter, Sophia, loves drawing with chalk on our driveway. Harmless stuff, flowers, rainbows, hopscotch. Karen showed up with photos and threatened to call Child Protective Services. Said I was letting her vandalize public property. Rosa had been forced to scrub the chalk off at midnight. She even wrote a formal apology. Sophia still asks why the mean lady doesn't want her to draw anymore, Rosa said, her voice cracking. Then Tommy Chen arrived, laptop in hand, folder under his arm. A 35-year-old IT engineer working remotely for a Silicon Valley firm. What he brought with him peeled back another layer of rot. "She banned me from air-drying clothes in my own backyard," he said, flipping through printed emails, claimed it violated the visual harmony of the neighborhood. The band forced him to buy a $1,200 electric dryer, doubling his utility bills. When he asked to see the rule, Karen claimed a vote had taken place, but she couldn't provide a date, or a witness, or minutes from the meeting. So I started logging everything, Tommy said. And what I found was disturbing. That's when I made a suggestion. Let's pool what we know, figure out what Karen's really up to. Tommy nodded. I might still have admin access to the HOA's website and internal system. Ernest, the last president, he gave me the password years ago when he needed help fixing the site. I doubt Karen knows enough to change it. 5 minutes later, Tommy's face lit up like a kid who just found a cheat code. She didn't change it, just added herself on top. What we found next was straight out of a crime drama. Karen had declared herself president after Ernest's abrupt resignation, but there was no record of any election, not a single vote cast. The community fund, once holding $85,000 for road work and emergencies, nearly empty. The money had been siphoned off through vague expense reports labeled urgent administrative services and consulting fees. And guess where that money went? Straight into Karen's personal accounts. New rules were pushed through via meetings that only Karen and Tanya attended without informing a single resident. Then there was Chuck. Turns out his security company, barely legitimate on paper, had been receiving $3,000 a month from HOA funds. That's 10 times what local firms charge for actual licensed security. But the darkest revelation was about Ernest Caldwell. He hadn't retired for health reasons, as Karen had claimed. She had blackmailed him using AI-generated photos designed to look like he'd had inappropriate relationships with much younger women. Deepfakes, disturbingly realistic ones. Ernest didn't try to fight it. He stepped down quietly, knowing his reputation, marriage, and legacy would be destroyed if the fake images ever went public. While all this was unfolding, Tommy stumbled onto something that, despite the seriousness of it all, made us burst out laughing. Karen had filed 47 noise complaints about dogs barking excessively, all tied to my address. The kicker? The complaints started 3 months before I moved in, and I'm the only dog owner in the neighborhood. She had launched a full campaign against me before she even knew who I was. Ranger, bless his golden heart, wasn't even on her radar yet. Bill stood up with a steadiness I hadn't seen in him all night. We need to find Ernest. He's still the rightful president, and if we can prove Karen forced him out through blackmail, he didn't have to finish. Everyone around that table was already on board. We need to restore real leadership to this neighborhood, Bill said firmly. Rosa nodded, her voice tight with conviction. And we have to report the embezzlement. That's $85,000. This isn't petty theft. That's a federal crime. I felt something stir deep in my chest, a familiar sensation I hadn't experienced since my days in uniform. A sense of purpose, righteous, focused, undeniable. We'll do this by the book, I said, standing tall and looking each of them in the eye. Not Karen's twisted version of the roulette, the real ones. That's when we heard car doors slamming outside. Peering through the window, I caught sight of Karen stepping out of a sheriff's department SUV like a smug villain arriving at the climax of a bad movie. Flanking her were Sheriff James Morrison and 2 young deputies. The smirk on her face could have curdled milk, a predatory grin full of malice and satisfaction. I've reported an illegal gathering, conspiracy to destroy property, and coordinated threats against the community, she shouted, loud enough for anyone within 3 blocks to hear. All of you are under arrest. Sheriff Morrison climbed out of his vehicle with the slow swagger of someone who expected obedience by default. He looked about 50, his gut sagging over his belt, a monument to years of skipping patrols and accepting free lunches. His red, sun-damaged face told the story of a man who'd logged more hours at the bar than at the gym. He radiated the stale confidence of a small-town official who'd never been challenged and didn't plan to start now. The 2 deputies, Miller and Johnson, followed behind, looking uncomfortably like they already regretted being dragged into whatever political storm was brewing here. I stepped forward, calm and composed, keeping my hands where everyone could see them. 30 years in the Navy taught me how to engage authority, respectfully, but without yielding an inch. Sheriff, I said evenly, using the same steady tone I'd once reserved for addressing admirals, I understand you've received a report. But this is a peaceful gathering on private property. Everything happening here is well within the law. Morrison spread his feet, folded his arms, and gave me the look of a man preparing to announce a guilty verdict before the trial had even started. I've received credible allegations of unlawful assembly, intent to damage property, and assault on HOA representatives, he declared with all the pomp of a man performing for an invisible camera. Multiple witnesses claim you used a dangerous trap to inflict harm. Without saying a word, I pulled out my phone and played the footage from Ranger's GoPro. There it was, crystal clear. Chuck charging with an illegal weapon, me calmly activating a marked irrigation system. Signs warning of automated sprinklers were plainly visible. The video showed Chuck electrocuting himself like a fool and the others slipping and tumbling as if they were reenacting a slapstick sketch. Even Morrison's smug expression wavered. He shifted uncomfortably as the truth began to overtake the performance. Karen, still full of bluster, stormed forward, phone in hand, waving it like a badge of righteousness. He planned this. I have video proof. He admitted to setting a trap. She thrust her phone at the sheriff, eager for vindication, but her video started a few minutes too early and captured her own voice loud and clear. If that old man doesn't cooperate, knock him out and drag him off his porch. I'll deal with the fallout later. Morrison's complexion turned from sunburned red to blotchy purple. Deputies Miller and Johnson exchanged wide-eyed glances. If they weren't already rethinking their loyalty, they were now. The case against me had just disintegrated before their eyes. Meanwhile, Tommy had been quietly streaming the entire conversation on the local Facebook group. I glanced at his phone. Over 300 live viewers. Comments were flooding in and neighbors sharing their own Karen Ya stories, confirming everything we'd said. And then, just when it seemed like the situation couldn't take another twist, a broken bar-weathered Toyota Camry pulled into the driveway. Out stepped Ernest Caldwell. He was 68, silver-haired, and carried himself with the calm authority of a man who'd spent his life doing things the right way. Dressed plainly but with purpose, he held a cardboard box under one arm and a laptop bag over his shoulder. He walked up to the group, every step deliberate. "Sheriff Morrison," he said with the weight of someone who'd once managed a community bank and knew how to make things official. "I need to file a formal report. Charges include abuse of office, misappropriation of funds, and extortion of HOA residents." Morrison blinked, looking utterly out of his depth. "And you are?" Ernest stood straighter, his tone unwavering. "Ernest Caldwell, I'm the legally elected president of the Clearwater Lake HOA. Karen Goldwater forced my resignation through blackmail, specifically, using fabricated digital images meant to destroy my personal and professional life. She's held power legally for the past 8 months. He set down the box and began organizing documents on the hood of the sheriff's SUV like a seasoned prosecutor preparing for trial. There was no election record naming Karen as anything but a resident. No votes, no minutes, nothing. There were email threads showing her threatening Ernest with AI-generated images designed to simulate scandalous behavior, deepfake blackmail, and then came the financials. The $85,000 she drained from the HOA's fund, all accounted for or traced through ghost invoices, phony repair jobs, and emergency consultations that never took place. The most damning proof, a full-blown forensic audit Ernest had quietly been conducting for months. It revealed the creation of multiple shell companies, fake entities set up to siphon funds and launder them back to Karen through non-existent contracts and bogus services. There were no repairs, no maintenance, no security patrols, just smoke, mirrors, and embezzlement on a scale that would have impressed the mob. The total amount Karen had siphoned off had now ballooned past $127,000. This wasn't just a theft anymore, it was a full-blown federal case. Morrison stared at the pile of evidence like a man watching his world collapse brick by brick. The documentation was thorough, undeniable, and damning, and with Tommy's livestream broadcasting every second, the sheriff knew there was no sweeping this under the rug. Karen's transformation was almost theatrical. The confident, smirking woman who had arrived with the law at her back was now unraveling in real time. Her complexion had drained to a ghostly white, and the look in her eyes was that of someone realizing the end was closing in. She shrieked incoherently, her voice cracking as she pointed fingers in every direction. "It's all fake. They're plotting against me." Ernest stepped down on his own, but even she didn't seem to believe her own protests anymore. Her words were hollow, frantic, No one in that yard was buying it. I locked eyes with her, steady and unflinching, channeling the same calm I'd summoned facing far more dangerous adversaries. "You have the right to remain silent, Karen," I said coolly, "and I suggest you take advantage of that right." Morrison had finally had enough. He reached for his cuffs. But before he could act, Karen let out one final burst of defiance, erupting like a zealot at a revival tent. "You fools don't understand anything," she bellowed. "The Marina Resort project will bring millions to this community. I've been doing all this for your benefit. I'm the only one with the vision to make this place great." There was something unhinged in her tone. This wasn't just greed talking anymore. It was conviction, delusion. She wasn't just lying to us, she was lying to herself, and believing every word. That fanatic gleam in her eyes set off every alarm bell in my gut. I dealt with zealots before, the kind who thought the ends justified the means, the kind who hid rot beneath righteousness. Something about her behavior told me we were only beginning to uncover the real depth of her crimes. Once Morrison placed her in custody and drove off with Karen in the back of his vehicle, I knew I couldn't let this go. Her operation felt too big, too strategic, too cold-blooded to be just about HOA power or embezzled funds. That night, I sat at my cabin's kitchen table with my laptop open, combing through public records, probate filings, and court databases. I wanted to know everything about Karen Goldwater, and what I discovered chilled me to the bone. Karen had long claimed that her late husband, Richard Goldwater, had left her a fortune after his passing, but according to financial records, the real money came from Eleanor Goldwater, Richard's 85-year-old mother. Karen had told everyone that Eleanor had revised her will to leave everything to her, over $3.2 million in assets, including 5 high-value properties. But the timeline surrounding Eleanor's decline was suspicious and too convenient to ignore. Eleanor, by all accounts, was a sharp-minded woman with a Stanford MBA and a firm grip on her finances, right up into her 80s. She managed family investments with impressive precision. Then suddenly, in March 2019, she was diagnosed with an unusually fast-acting form of dementia. By September, barely 6 months later, she had drafted a brand new will naming Karen as sole beneficiary, cutting out both her son Richard and her grandson Michael entirely. By December, Eleanor was dead. The whole sequence felt staged, clinical and rehearsed. Dementia rarely progresses that fast, especially in someone with her cognitive history. Something didn't sit right. I tracked down the name of Eleanor's former physician, Dr. Patricia Rivesa, and contacted her that same evening. After I explained the situation and showed my credentials, she agreed to meet me privately at her clinic. Dr. Reeves, a seasoned family doctor with over 2 decades of experience, was composed, but I could sense unease in her voice as we spoke. "I've been unsettled by Eleanor's case for years," she admitted. "She was mentally sharp, sharper than most people 20 years younger. But then, almost overnight, she became paranoid, forgetful, confused." But only when Karen was in the room. That last detail stopped me cold. "What do you mean only when Karen was present?" "She'd be perfectly coherent during private exams," Dr. Reeves explained. "Eleanor even asked me once why Karen kept telling everyone she was losing her memory when she wasn't. She said her mind felt fine." A chill ran down my spine. "Are you saying Karen might have induced her symptoms?" Dr. Reeves nodded solemnly. "Karen insisted on attending every appointment. Said Eleanor needed constant monitoring. She always brought pill boxes and never let Eleanor handle her own medication. When Dr. Reeves once suggested an independent psychiatric evaluation, Karen had reacted aggressively, threatening to pull Eleanor from her care entirely. That's when I asked the doctor to review Eleanor's prescription records. What we found was shocking. Karen had obtained large quantities of powerful psychiatric medication, Lorazepam, Haloperidol, diphenhydramine, from 5 different pharmacies, often using fake patient names. These drugs, especially in combination, could cause severe confusion, drowsiness, and hallucinations, exactly the symptoms Eleanor had reportedly shown. I contacted Tommy again, and he helped me gain access to archived security footage from the Golden Sunset nursing home, where Eleanor had spent her final months. What we found was devastating. Video recordings showed Karen visiting Eleanor's room daily, always alone, and administering vitamins to her mother-in-law. But given what we now knew about the drugs she'd been acquiring, There was little doubt those pills weren't just supplements. The pills Karen had been giving Eleanor were speckled white with blue and not at all like the standard issue yellow vitamins given to other residents. It became horrifyingly clear. Karen had been deliberately sedating Eleanor to simulate the symptoms of dementia. She wasn't just manipulating Eleanor, she was manufacturing mental decline to render her legally incompetent and vulnerable. The final piece of this twisted puzzle came from Ernest Caldwell. It turned out that Ernest had been Eleanor's original estate attorney back in 2018 and had personally drafted her will. That version of the will was a far cry from the one Karen eventually pushed through. In the original document, Eleanor had divided her estate between several charities including the Salvation Army and the American Red Cross and left a sizable inheritance to her grandson, Michael. Karen's name didn't appear once. Eleanor had even confided in Ernest that she didn't trust Karen's judgment when it came to money and didn't want her anywhere near the family fortune. Digging further, I found that Karen had gone to disturbing lengths long before Eleanor's condition ever changed. She had hired a private investigator to tail Eleanor for 4 straight months, tracking her routines, prescriptions, and daily habits with the precision of a surveillance operative. Karen had mapped out every detail of Eleanor's life like she was preparing for a military strike, and perhaps most chilling of all, Karen had spent nearly a year beforehand studying dementia. She enrolled in caregiver courses, absorbed academic papers on neurological decline, and pored over guides to elder care. She'd effectively trained herself to simulate the effects of cognitive failure by administering specific medications over time. This wasn't impulsive. It was a meticulously orchestrated crime, a slow-motion execution. The deeper I looked, the more it became clear that Karen had been playing the long game from the very beginning. Even more damning were email records between her and her late husband, Richard. The earliest exchanges dated back to 2018. They referred to Eleanor as a financial obstacle and used ominous phrases like "we need to speed up the schedule" and "she's too healthy for her own good." These weren't just family disagreements, they read like internal communications in a conspiracy to commit murder. I was reviewing this mountain of evidence with Ernest and Tommy when Tommy's phone lit up with an alert from his surveillance system. He went pale instantly. "Dylan," he said, voice low, "I've been monitoring Karen's digital activity. She just placed a dark web order for enough fentanyl to kill a horse, and the shipping address a broken bar is your cabin." That hit me like a gut punch. Karen wasn't just a financial predator, she was lethal. She had already taken at least one life, and now I was clearly next on her list. But I wasn't about to wait around. My years in the Navy had taught me one critical lesson. In the face of imminent danger, you don't defend, you strike. The next morning, I called for one final community gathering at my cabin, but this time, there was a surprise guest. Jake Morrison revealed himself as the mysterious ally who had been warning me all along, and what he revealed shook the entire room. "I'm Special Agent Jake Morrison," he announced, flashing credentials far more convincing than the landscaping gear he'd worn while blending into the neighborhood. "I've been working undercover as a maintenance worker while investigating a multi-state organized crime syndicate focused on elder fraud and inheritance manipulation. Karen Goldwater is our top suspect." Then he opened a briefcase packed with classified-level evidence that put all of our amateur efforts to shame. He had toxicology reports from secretly preserved blood samples, showing Eleanor had been drugged to lethal levels. Email records between Karen and Richard detailed what they called permanent solutions to family finances. Online purchase receipts for illegal pharmaceuticals traced directly to Karen's aliases and IP addresses. Video surveillance footage from nursing homes in 3 different states showed Karen using the exact same poisoning routine on other elderly patients. But the biggest revelation? Karen had also killed Richard, her own husband, in 2018, using the same slow-acting cocktail of psychiatric medications she'd later use on Eleanor. "This case has been in the works for over 2 years, Jake explained, his demeanor now all business. "We knew she'd escalate eventually. We just needed enough to prove the pattern across jurisdictions." He looked me in the eye. "Dylan, you weren't bait." "Exactly, but your refusal to back down did push her to make mistakes. Mistakes that gave us exactly what we needed." Just as Jake finished speaking, the sound of approaching vehicles shattered the quiet. Engines revved aggressively, tires crunched over gravel, and I knew immediately we were about to face the storm head-on. Karen had arrived for what she clearly intended to be her final move against me, and she didn't come alone. Chuck the Bull Morrison emerged looking like he'd been training for a UFC title fight, armed not just with his usual electric baton, but also industrial zip ties, clearly ready to do more than just intimidate. Behind him came 6 men, all muscle-bound and dressed in tactical black, like something out of a discount action movie. They moved in formation, disciplined, but stiff. I spotted it instantly. These weren't real operators. Their movements were too rehearsed, their gear too pristine. They looked like stuntmen waiting for their cue, not professionals ready for combat. Marcus Steele, freshly scrubbed and cleaned, was back to now holding what appeared to be an official court order, complete with a fake embossed seal, but anyone familiar with Karen's forgery skills would know it was counterfeit. Sheriff Morrison brought up the rear, wearing the look of a man trapped between a paycheck and his morals, and by the grim set of his jaw, it looked like the paycheck was winning. Then, Karen stepped out of her luxury SUV like a mafia queen surveying the battlefield. Karen stepped from her BMW like a general prepared to win the war that would cement her twisted legacy. She raised her voice, projecting across the lake like a siren. "This is an emergency property seizure under eminent domain," she declared, every word brimming with fabricated authority. "Dylan McKenzie has been classified a domestic terrorist and this cabin is being seized for public safety." It was pure delusion, but the scariest kind, because she clearly believed every word of her own fantasy. That was the moment I decided enough was enough. The time for watching and waiting was over. I would end this with the same calculated precision that earned me respect as a naval officer. I stepped onto my deck, calm and composed, like a man who had faced real threats before and not some suburban cosplay militia. I locked eyes with each of the costumed mercenaries surrounding Karen. "You've crossed every line, Karen," I said. "You've killed innocent people, terrified a whole community, and now you're trying to murder me to bury your crimes. It's over." Chuck Morrison and his 6 goon squad members started to fan out, attempting a classic pincer maneuver, textbook formation, poorly executed, but they'd underestimated one key variable. I let out a high-pitched whistle I'd trained 4 days with Ranger. It was a custom signaler, one I'd taught to nearly every dog in the neighborhood. Ranger exploded out of the cabin like a 4-legged rocket. Behind him came 8 more dogs from nearby homes, forming a chaotic, barking whirlwind around Karen's squad. They weren't attacking, they didn't need to. The synchronized barking and circling had the effect of a trained military drill team with teeth. The so-called mercenaries cracked immediately. I didn't sign up to fight dogs. One of them screamed, bolting toward the cars. "This isn't what we rehearsed." Another yelled it, confirming what I'd suspected all along. These weren't mercenaries, they were actors, probably hired for what they thought was a prank video or amateur action film. While their coordination collapsed into a barking, panicked mess, I triggered Phase 2. The upgraded irrigation system kicked in. Unlike last time, this version sprayed a slick blend of non-toxic paint and clay-based sleep, a concoction that turned my yard into something between a skating rink and a Jackson Pollock painting. Chuck charged, baton raised like a berserker warrior, but I stepped aside with the ease of someone who'd practiced dodging swinging cranes and rogue waves for a living. Chuck hit the slippery surface full speed and went airborne, landing face first in the rainbow-colored mud. He slid a full 10 feet before coming to rest in a pose that screamed both defeat and humiliation. His backup tried to retreat with whatever dignity they could salvage, but it was too late. The yard had become a slapstick trap. They slipped, stumbled, crashed into each other, and fell in such spectacular fashion that, under different circumstances, I might have applauded. Marcus Steele pulled out his phone to call for help, but before he could dial, Jake Morrison stepped forward, flashing his FBI badge in the sunlight like a sword of justice. "Marcus Steele," Jake said, voice cool and commanding, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, document fraud, and involvement in an organized criminal operation." He turned to Karen. "Karen Goldwater, you're facing multiple federal charges, including first-degree murder, fraud, and orchestrating a criminal enterprise across state lines." I stood on my deck, bone dry, still holding my coffee like it was just another Tuesday morning. Chuck was face down in rainbow-colored sludge. His actors were scrambling for the cars like extras fleeing a ruined lake. "Forgot to mention the irrigation upgrade," I said, satisfied. Engineering habit I never quite shook. The events that followed are what the local news would later call the Great Lakefront Takedown, and unfolded with cinematic precision. Jake's FBI team swept in, gathering evidence, taking statements, and securing the scene like seasoned professionals. Karen Goldwater, once the queen of manipulation, was led away in cuffs that looked far too small for the weight of her crimes. She had manipulated, bullied, and murdered to build her empire of fear. But now, justice was catching up. Over the next few days, the full scale of her criminal enterprise emerged through FBI briefings that read like chapters from a crime thriller. Karen was officially charged with 9 felonies, including the murders of Eleanor and Richard Goldwater, along with 3 other elderly victims across state lines of deaths that had been misclassified as natural until now. The financial crimes were staggering. Over $200,000 in embezzled funds through shell companies and forged contracts spread across multiple jurisdictions. Chuck Morrison faced charges of assault, weapons violations, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. Marcus Steele was permanently disbarred and sentenced to 5 years for document fraud and aiding a criminal syndicate. Surprisingly, Sheriff Morrison emerged with his badge intact barely. Jake testified that the sheriff had been misled by Karen's complex manipulation, and while his judgment had been poor, his eventual cooperation during the final confrontation spared him from prosecution. He received a departmental suspension and a formal reprimand. As for the 6 hired mercenaries, they were let off with steep fines for participating in an unauthorized operation. They genuinely believed they were part of some elaborate training video or promotional campaign, not a live criminal conspiracy. But what surprised me most came not from the justice system but from learning about Karen's own past, revealed in fragments during the FBI's ongoing investigation. While reviewing the FBI's investigation files, I came across a background that was as tragic as it was disturbing. Before marrying into the Goldwater family, Karen Richardson had lived a life defined by hardship. Raised in a rundown trailer park just outside Mobile, Alabama, she endured a childhood of relentless poverty. Her mother disappeared when she was only 8, leaving Karen behind with a father who toggled between neglect and violence depending on how drunk he was. By 7th grade, she had dropped out of school to juggle multiple jobs. At one point, she spent 2 years homeless on the streets of Atlanta, surviving any way she could in a world that offered her no kindness, no safety, and no second chances. Understanding her psychological profile didn't absolve the horrific things she'd done, but it did shed light on the origins of her desperate need for control and her obsessive fear of powerlessness. Karen hadn't been born cruel, as she had been forged in abandonment, molded by trauma. According to the FBI psychologist, she suffered from deep PTSD, attachment disorders, and a pathological fear of returning to the vulnerability of her past. Her crimes weren't just about greed, they were her armor against a world that had always left her exposed. This revelation sparked a decision in me that caught everyone off guard, even myself. Instead of celebrating her downfall, I began writing to Karen in prison, not to condone what she did or downplay the pain she caused, but to offer her something she'd never known: an unconditional human kindness. No strings, no expectations, just empathy. I also reached out to Michael Goldwater, Eleanor's grandson and rightful heir, and together we set up a legal defense fund to ensure Karen received proper representation and access to the psychological treatment she desperately needed behind bars. 3 months after what Tommy Chen jokingly called the mudslide miracle, our neighborhood had transformed into something we never imagined possible. Ernest Caldwell was unanimously re-elected as HOA president, with me as vice president and Rosa Martinez stepping in as treasurer. She brought full financial transparency to the table, and we restructured the HOA around genuine community service and not arbitrary rules or obsessive property value enforcement. As news spread of our transformation, property values in Clearwater Lake shot up by 15%. But that wasn't the only surprise. What none of us expected was how our story captured the world's imagination. Tommy's video series chronicling our investigation in the wild, unforgettable showdown had gone viral, over 15 million views, shared across platforms in more than 30 countries. But it wasn't just the drama that resonated. The story struck a chord about justice, redemption, and how communities can confront evil without becoming it. I was sitting on my rebuilt deck one morning at the same one our neighbors had helped raise like a modern barn raising when Tommy came sprinting over, laptop in hand. Dylan, the follow-up video about your letters to Karen and the defense fund is blowing up. Major news networks are picking it up. People are calling it a blueprint for how to heal instead of hate. I chuckled, taking a sip of coffee. All I'd ever wanted was to fish in Pecia, and now I was accidentally leading a movement in restorative justice. Then came the letter that moved me more than any viral video ever could. It was from Karen, written in slow, deliberate script like someone finally taking time to reflect. It read, "Mr. Mackenzie, the food here isn't exactly what I used to expect, but at least I don't have to cook it myself. More importantly, for the first time in my adult life, I feel safe. Safe from the constant fear that someone would find out I wasn't as powerful as I pretended to be. Safe from the nightmare of ending up back in the trailer park, with nothing and no one. Your letters helped me realize something, that justice and revenge aren't the same, and maybe even someone like me doesn't deserve to be thrown away forever. Thank you, a broken bar, for not letting me die with my hatred." As I read her words, I realized that our victory hadn't been about outsmarting a criminal or reclaiming property. It had been about something far greater. We proved that a neighborhood could heal itself and even offer healing to those who had caused it pain. That justice doesn't have to be cruel. That sometimes the bravest act of resistance is choosing compassion when cruelty would be easier. I folded Karen's letter and tucked it into my pocket. Then I grabbed my fishing rod and walked down to the lake, its water crystal clear and reflecting the flawless sky above. In that reflection, I saw not just the man I'd become but the community we had become. We learned that real strength comes not from domination, but from lifting others up. That the most effective weapon against hate is the refusal to return it, because all of us know what it feels like when it seems like the bullies hold all the power, or when good people feel like they're losing ground. Maybe you've had your own Karen, someone who used authority or rules or fear to make your life harder. But Dylan's story is proof. Smart thinking beats brute force. Real justice isn't about punishing, it's about rebuilding. If stories like this remind you that ordinary people can stand up to corruption and choose healing over hate, don't forget to like and subscribe to Ya Stories. We're here to share tales of neighbors rising together, not tearing each other down. And hey, we're not saying your HOA president is spying with binoculars. A broken bar, but we're not saying that either. Thanks for joining us here at JA Stories, where the worst neighborhood nightmares get rewritten into something worth believing in.